January 22nd, 1813. At Frenchtown, the United States will suffer yet another disastrous defeat. It will force William Henry Harrison, commander of the American Army of the Northwest, to abandon his attempt to retake Detroit. While the British force, emboldened by their victory, will launch their own offensive, striking deep into Ohio and Indiana. Though U.S. fortunes were about to turn, as Harrison would soon launch a brilliant military campaign, featuring one of the largest sieges of the war and America's first decisive naval victory, allowing Harrison to capture large parts of Canada. With the defeat at Frenchtown, Harrison would order his force to fall back to the Portage River. Meanwhile, the British force, hampered by winter, would fall back to Amherstburg, where Proctor would begin making plans and preparations to renew the offensive in spring. Harrison, once again being put on the back foot, would attempt to fortify his position in northwestern Ohio, ordering the construction of several forts, most notably Fort Meigs along the Maumee River and Fort Stephenson on the Sandusky, greatly improving both his ability to defend as well as supply and protect his forces from native raids. With the dawn of spring, British Brigadier General Henry Proctor would begin making preparations to attack Harrison's base in Ohio. His first target would be the newly constructed Fort Meigs, departing from his base at Amherstburg in April. With the news of the British movements, Harrison would quickly work to bolster the defense of the fort, arriving with supplies and reinforcements, while also persuading Isaac Shelby, the governor of Kentucky, to call up 2 regiments of Kentucky militia under Brigadier General Green Clay, though they would fail to reach the fort before Proctor. Despite being delayed by heavy rain, Proctor's force would set out on April 23rd, sailing across Lake Erie to Maumee Bay, where he would rendezvous with Tecumseh and Roundhead's combined native force on April 29th, before besieging the fort. The following night, Proctor's bombardment would begin. Despite lasting several days, the bombardment caused limited damage due to the extensive earthworks inside the fort. Harrison would have his artillery return fire, but due to his limited supply of ammunition, the shelling had little effect. On May 3rd, Clay's Kentucky militia would arrive, having sailed down the Maumee River to Fort Meigs. With the British unaware of the reinforcements, Harrison hoped to capitalize, devising a plan to attack the British batteries. Clay was to divide his force. Half under the command of Dudley were to land on the north side of the river and destroy the British guns, before then retreating to the boats and joining with Clay's force to the south, before proceeding to the fort. Meanwhile, Colonel John Miller would launch a sortie to the east, hopefully neutralizing a large portion of the British guns. As Dudley's force made landfall, they would quickly storm and take the British position, driving off the British gunners with little opposition. Though their attempts to disable the guns would fail, as supplies needed to properly spike them were aboard Clay's boats on the opposite side of the river. Further confusion about the ultimate aim of the mission meant that no attempt was made to return to the boats. As a result, the Kentucky militia soon came under intense fire from indigenous warriors in the woods, and counterattacks from British regulars would force them back. In the confusion, Dudley would be killed, and the disorganized Kentucky militia was decimated, with only 150 of the original 866 men safely managing to reach the boats. On the opposite bank, Clay's force had faced light resistance as they advanced towards Fort Meigs, with Harrison ordering his dragoons and a company of infantry to sortie and conduct the men to safety. To the east of the fort, Harrison's attack under Colonel John Miller would see a success, overrun the battery and spike the guns, before withdrawing back to the fort in hard fighting. The battle would prove inconclusive, disabling some of the British batteries, but at a heavy cost. By May 9th, Proctor, unable to take the fort, would abandon his siege. He would sail back up the Maumee River to Lake Erie, from where he would besiege Harrison's other newly established Fort Stephenson, though the subsequent assault on the fortress would prove a disaster. Despite outnumbering the Americans roughly 10-1, their assault will be repulsed with heavy losses. With little options left, Proctor will retreat. When the war broke out in 1812, the British immediately seized control of Lake Erie. Their small number of warships under the Provincial Marine far outnumbered any American naval ships on the lake. But by mid-1813, the British situation was beginning to turn dire. On Lake Ontario, American actions had meant Proctor's force was now running low on supplies and reinforcements. The United States had also begun construction of a fleet at Presque Isle, later being reinforced by ships from the Niagara frontier. In early August, the squadron under the command of Oliver Perry would set sail, eventually dropping anchor at Put-in Bay, effectively blockading the British naval force under Barclay and preventing the movement of supplies to Amherstburg. With the settlement running out of resources, Barclay would be forced to seek battle. On the morning of September 10th, American sentries would spot Barclay's vessels in the distance. Perry would order his fleet to quickly weigh anchor and move to engage the British ships. As the squadrons neared, both contingents would form into line of battle, with their heaviest vessels positioned near the center of their respective lines. At close range, Perry believes his American ships will hold the advantage, but the wind is weak, meaning his ships will likely take heavy fire until they can successfully close the gap, a risky gamble. By 11:45 a.m., Perry's first ships have crossed into range as the British fleet begins opening fire from distance. The Detroit, formerly an American ship captured at the Fall of Detroit the previous year, now acts as Barclay's flagship, whose long-range rounds now tear through the Lawrence as she crawls toward the British line. For the next 20 minutes, Lawrence will be a sitting duck to the British guns. By 12:45, the Lawrence will have closed enough to return fire, though it will soon become evident that at the current range, the American guns are not as effective as expected, as Lawrence keeps getting pounded, with multiple British ships now concentrating their fire. Meanwhile, the other American ships, namely the second major brig, the Niagara, are still outside effective cannon range, meaning their support is doing little to dull the dire situation on board the Lawrence. At this point, Perry's flagship has lost about 80% of its crew, and the ship itself is quickly being reduced to a wreck. With the situation on board Lawrence now untenable, Perry orders her to strike her colors, while he hurriedly boards a small boat, aiming to row half a mile through active gunfire to retake command aboard the still intact Niagara. Who has by now closed the distance with the other British ships, firing devastating broadsides. The British situation now is beginning to turn dire. With the rest of the American fleet able to return fire, the situation on board their ships is quickly beginning to deteriorate. Many of their officers have been killed, and Barclay is also severely wounded. Meanwhile, two of the large British sloops, the Detroit and Queen Charlotte, collide. Due to their damaged state, they are virtually unmanageable. Nevertheless, the British still anticipate the Niagara to lead the American schooners away in retreat. Though once Perry reached the Niagara and boarded, he would quickly order the remaining ships to further close, while steering the Niagara towards Barclay's damaged flagship. Helped by a sudden strengthening of the wind, he would pass directly in front of the two ships, firing a raking broadside as he passed, effectively crippling the ships. By 3 p.m., the two ships struck their colors, effectively ending the battle. The victory would be decisive, capturing all 6 British warships and firmly giving the Americans control of Lake Erie. Following the defeat, Proctor's supply lines to Amherstburg in Detroit, which mainly ran along Lake Erie, would be untenable. In early August, he would begin planning his withdrawal back to Canada, ending his invasion of the American Northwest. With news of the victories, Harrison immediately began a campaign to retake Detroit and capture Amherstburg. A regiment of mounted infantry, led by Colonel Richard Johnson, rode north from Fort Meigs, while Harrison's regulars and militia sailed from Sandusky Bay across Lake Erie to Amherstburg. Aware of Harrison's moves, Proctor had decided to abandon the city. His provisions were running low, and much of his artillery had already been removed. On September 27th, he ordered the fort and naval yard to be torched and began his retreat along the Thames River with 880 British regulars, followed by Tecumseh and 1,200 warriors and their families. Late the same afternoon, Harrison's main force landed near Amherstburg. Several days later, Johnson's mounted infantry arrived at Detroit before crossing the river and joining Harrison's force. On October 2nd, they set off in pursuit of the British force. Tecumseh knew that Procter's retreat and the loss of Upper Canada would effectively end British support for his Confederation, though his attempts to convince Procter to make a stand had little effect. The soldiers had all grown increasingly demoralized, and with Procter's apparent refusal to make a stand, roughly half of Tecumseh's initial 1,200 warriors would abandon the army. Harrison's force continued to move swiftly, and by the afternoon of October 5th, had caught Procter's force just west of Moraviantown. Due to the proximity of the Americans, Procter ordered his men to form two lines in an open wood, between the river bank and a forested swamp, with a single artillery piece positioned astride the road. Due to lack of tools, which had been lost in the retreat, Procter was unable to fortify his position, meaning Harrison's large contingent of mounted troops would be unimpeded if they decided on an attack. Tecumseh's remaining followers positioned themselves in the marsh, hoping to outflank and encircle the American contingent when they attacked Procter's line. However, Harrison's scouts had observed the native positions, allowing Harrison to detach several units to protect his left flank from Tecumseh's warriors. Seeing the rest of the British position, the Americans planned to launch the attack with their mounted contingent, in addition to 120 regulars, which would advance along the thickly wooded riverbank and seize the British cannon. Meanwhile, on the left flank, a 2nd Battalion would attack Tecumseh's warriors in the marsh. As the American attack began, the British fired a ragged volley that did little to stop the advance. As the Americans crashed into the British line, it quickly collapsed, with the British cannon being unable to fire before being overtaken. Despite Procter's attempt to rally his men, the ferocity of the attack caused most of the British to surrender. On the left flank, after passing through the small swamp, the 2nd Mounted Contingent crashed into Tecumseh's left flank. Meanwhile, Harrison ordered his infantry to advance to the indigenous right. As the American force charged forward, they would quickly push Tecumseh's warriors back, but the entangled growth of the marsh would force them to dismount and fight on foot. In the brutal ensuing melee, Tecumseh would be killed, and Johnson would be seriously wounded. Within 30 minutes, the indigenous force would be scattered and forced to retreat. The battle was decisive, with roughly 75% of the British native contingent either killed or captured, and Tecumseh's death would have dire consequences for his Confederacy and any hope of further native resistance in the Northwest, as he would subsequently burn Moraviantown before withdrawing to Detroit for winter.